In the waning light of a February day in the year 272, in the modest military settlement of Nisus, a child entered a world convulsing with change. The Roman Empire, that great colossus which had dominated the known world for centuries, found itself fractured and bleeding. Emperors rose and fell like autumn leaves, and the very idea of Rome seemed to dissolve into the chaos of what historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century. The boy born that day bore a name that would echo through the ages, Flavius Valerius Constantinus, yet nothing in the circumstances of his birth suggested the magnitude of what was to come. Nessus, located in what we now call Serbia, was a frontier town, a place where Roman civilization met the raw edge of the barbarian world. Here, soldiers stood watch against Gothic raiders, and the old certainties of empire felt distant and fragile. His father, Constantius Chlorus, the Pale, served as a military officer of some distinction, a man climbing the ranks through merit and marriages carefully chosen. But it was his mother who would forever shape the mystery surrounding Constantine's origins. Helena, she was called, a name that would later be sanctified, though her beginnings were anything but saintly in the eyes of Roman aristocracy. The sources whisper conflicting stories about Helena. Some claim she worked as an innkeeper, a stabularia, serving food and drink to travelers along the military roads. Others suggest she was a barmaid, perhaps something less respectable still. What remains certain is this: she was not of noble birth, not the kind of woman a rising military man would acknowledge openly once he reached for greater heights. Into this world of uncertainty and ambition, Constantine emerged. The empire he was born into bore little resemblance to the glory days of Augustus or Trajan. Diocletian, who would soon seize power, had not yet introduced his radical solution to the empire's chaos. The tetrarchy, that system of 4 rulers meant to stabilize what seemed unstable beyond repair. The frontiers burned with invasion, the economy groaned under debased currency, and the old gods seemed to have turned their faces away from Rome. Yet perhaps there was something fitting in Constantine being born at such a moment of transformation. He arrived not in the marble palaces of Rome, but on the frontier where Roman and barbarian order and chaos constantly negotiated their boundaries. He came not from the old senatorial aristocracy, but from the new military elite that would come to define the later empire. And he was born to a woman whose very existence the historical record struggles to define, neither quite Roman nor quite outside of Rome, neither quite respectable nor quite scandalous. The infant knew nothing of these complexities, of course. He knew only the warmth of his mother's arms, the sounds of a military camp, the particular quality of light that falls on the Balkans in late winter. But destiny, that force the Romans called fatum, had already begun to weave its intricate patterns around him. The boy born in Nisus would one day remake the world his parents knew, would transform the very meaning of what it meant to be Roman, what it meant to worship, what it meant to rule. The years of childhood passed in a state of profound uncertainty. Young Constantine grew in the shadow of a question that must have haunted him. Who, exactly, was he? His father climbed higher in the imperial service, his military prowess and political acumen opening doors that had once seemed forever closed. But with each step up the ladder of power, Constantine's own position grew more precarious. When Constantius was summoned to join Maximian as Caesar in the West, the price of ambition became brutally clear. To cement alliances among the tetrarchy's ruling elite, Constantius was required to put aside Helena and marry Theodora, the stepdaughter of Emperor Maximian. This was how power worked in late Rome. Marriages were treaties written in flesh and blood, and love, if it had ever existed, was irrelevant to the machinery of empire. For Helena, the dismissal must have been devastating. Cast aside, her status reverted to something uncertain, something whispered about in corners. She had been companion to a rising officer. Now she was merely the discarded woman, the embarrassing first alliance that successful men often wished to forget. The sources maintain a discreet silence about these years, but we can imagine the sting of rejection, the humiliation of being replaced by someone whose only virtue was her connections. For Constantine, the situation was more complex still. He was his father's son, this could not be denied, but he was not the son of the right mother. In a world obsessed with legitimacy and proper lineage, he occupied a liminal space. Theodora would bear Constantius 6 children, each one a potential rival, each one born from a marriage sanctioned by imperial approval. Constantine remained the eldest, but also the one whose mother's name was spoken in tones that mixed pity with contempt. Yet perhaps this very uncertainty, this ambiguity of position, forged something essential in the boy's character. He learned early that nothing was guaranteed, that favor could be withdrawn as easily as granted. He understood, in a way that children born to secure positions never quite grasp, that the world was not a fixed thing, but something constantly in flux, where today's certainty became tomorrow's ruin. The young Constantine was sent to the court of Diocletian in Nicomedia, the eastern capital where the senior Augustus held sway. This was presented as an honor, the son of a Caesar receiving education in the imperial court. But it was also unmistakably a hostage situation. Diocletian understood the importance of keeping the children of subordinates close, where they served as living guarantees of their father's loyalty. So Constantine found himself far from his mother, far from his father, living in a court of exquisite luxury and subtle danger. Nicomedia was a city of marble and intrigue, where courtiers spoke in whispers and every smile might conceal a knife. Here, the boy who had been born on the frontier, whose mother had been cast aside, whose very legitimacy was questioned, would learn the arts of survival in the most sophisticated and treacherous environment in the world. He was Helena's son, always. This much he would never forget. And perhaps it was this very fact, this uncomfortable truth about his origins, that would later drive him to elevate her to sainthood, to send her on pilgrimage to find the true cross, to ensure that history would remember her not as a discarded concubine, but as the mother of Constantine the Great. The eastern capital of Nicomedia shimmered with a splendor that must have astounded the young Constantine. Here, Emperor Diocletian had created something that approached the magnificence of the old Persian kings, a court of ceremony and distance, where the emperor became not merely a man, but a living manifestation of divine authority. Gone were the days when a soldier could clap his emperor on the shoulder. Now one prostrated oneself before the purple, performed elaborate rituals of obeisance, and spoke only when granted permission. For a youth whose childhood had been spent in military camps and frontier towns, the transformation was total. Constantine found himself immersed in a world of Greek philosophy and Latin rhetoric, of ceremonial protocol and religious mystery. The court attracted the finest minds and the most ambitious schemers, and the line between the two was often impossible to draw. His education was thorough and deliberate. He studied the classic texts, Homer and Virgil, Cicero and Demosthenes. He learned the arts of war through the accounts of Alexander and Caesar, understanding that military glory remained the surest path to power in Rome, regardless of how elaborate the court ceremonies had become. He trained with weapons, rode horses across the Asian plains, and participated in the military exercises that kept the Eastern legions sharp. But the most important education came from simply observing. Diocletian's court was a masterclass in the exercise of power. The old emperor had devised the tetrarchy as a solution to the chaos that had nearly destroyed Rome. Two senior emperors, the Augusti, would rule alongside two junior partners, the Caesars. Each would control a portion of the empire, but all would work in concert. It was brilliant in theory, a system designed to prevent civil war and ensure smooth succession. Constantine watched how this system functioned in practice. He saw how carefully Diocletian balanced the interests of his colleagues, how he used marriage alliances to bind the tetrarchs together, how he played one faction against another while maintaining the appearance of unity. These were lessons that would serve Constantine well in the decades to come. But there was something else Constantine witnessed during these years, something that would haunt him and perhaps shape his greatest decision. In 303, when Constantine was in his early 30s, Diocletian launched what would become known as the Great Persecution. The Christians, that peculiar sect that had been spreading through the empire for 2.5 centuries, were to be crushed once and for all. Constantine saw the edicts proclaimed. He watched as churches were demolished, scriptures burned, clergy arrested. He witnessed Christians forced to sacrifice to the old gods or face imprisonment, torture, and death. He saw men and women choose agony rather than renounce their faith, a choice that must have seemed incomprehensible to those raised in traditional Roman religion, where one simply honored whichever god seemed most useful at the moment. What did Constantine think as he watched these persecutions unfold? The sources give us no clear answer, but we know he was there in the court, observing how religious policy intersected with imperial power. We know he saw both the determination of the persecutors and the stubborn courage of the persecuted. And we know that in less than a decade, he would reverse everything Diocletian had. Attempted would not merely end the persecution, but would elevate Christianity to a position of imperial favor that would have seemed impossible in these dark days. The youth in Nicomedia was learning, absorbing, preparing. The frontier boy was becoming a man of the world, learning to navigate courts and armies, philosophy and faith, loyalty and betrayal. The year 305 brought seismic changes to the Roman world. Diocletian, in an unprecedented act of self-abnegation, abdicated his throne. He retired to his palace in Split on the Dalmatian coast, where he would famously spend his remaining years tending cabbages and refusing all pleas to return to power. Maximian, his co-Augustus in the west, was compelled to abdicate as well. The system of succession that Diocletian had so carefully constructed now moved into its next phase. Constantius Chlorus, Constantine's father, was elevated from Caesar to Augustus of the West. This should have been Constantine's moment, the son of an Augustus, poised to enter the imperial college himself. But the new order had other plans. Galerius, now senior Augustus in the east, harbored no fondness for Constantine. Instead, Galerius elevated his own favorites, Severus in the west and Maximinus Dio in the east. Constantine remained in Nicomedia, technically honored, practically a prisoner. He had served with distinction in military campaigns along the Danube frontier and against Persia. He had proven himself capable, intelligent, ambitious, all of which made him dangerous to the new regime. Galerius, that rough soldier who had risen from Illyrian peasant stock, understood the threat that a capable rival represented. The court whispers suggested that Constantine's life was not secure. Galerius, it was said, looked for opportunities to eliminate this inconvenient young man, perhaps in some risky military expedition from which he might not return, perhaps through more direct means. Constantine understood that remaining in the east meant death, delayed perhaps, but inevitable. So he fled. The details of his escape have been embellished by later sources into something approaching legend. Some accounts claim he disabled the imperial posting stations behind him as he rode westward, killing or crippling the horses to prevent pursuit. Others suggest he received secret permission from Galerius, who was glad to be rid of him. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between certainty and myth. What we know is this: Constantine rode hard across the empire, covering a distance that would normally take weeks in a matter of days. He crossed from Asia Minor into Europe, thundered through the Balkans, raced across Gaul, and finally reached the shores of Britannia. There, in the northernmost province of the Roman world, he found his father preparing for a campaign against the Picts. The reunion must have been profound. Constantius had not seen his son in years, had perhaps wondered if he would ever see him again. Now here stood Constantine, no longer a boy but a man of 33, hardened by years at Diocletian's court, skilled in war and politics, carrying within him all the learning and cunning of the Eastern Empire. Together, father and son embarked on the campaign against the Picts, those fierce tribes who inhabited the highlands beyond Hadrian's Wall. It was brutal fighting in a brutal landscape, mist-shrouded mountains, trackless forests, an enemy who knew every hill and glen and used them mercilessly. But it was also a chance for Constantine to prove himself to his father's legions, to show that he was not merely a courtier, but a soldier worthy of the name. The campaign was ultimately successful, pushing the Picts back beyond the old borders. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Constantius, never robust, his nickname Chloris meant the Pale, fell ill. The northern climate, the stress of campaign, the weight of years, all of these extracted their toll. On July 25th, 306, in the city of Eboracum, what we now call York, Constantius Chlorus died. He had been Augustus for barely a year. In that moment, as his father drew his last breath, Constantine stood at a crossroads that would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of the entire Roman world. The body was still warm when the legions made their move. This was how power transferred in the late Roman Empire, not through the careful constitutional arrangements that Diocletian had envisioned, but through the raw will of armed men who understood that they held the real authority. The soldiers gathered in Eboracum had loved Constantius. They had followed him through campaigns in Britannia and Gaul, had trusted his leadership, had prospered under his command. Now they looked at his son and saw the continuation of that bond. On that same July day, with the body of Constantius perhaps not yet cold, the legions proclaimed Constantine as Augustus. They lifted him on their shields in the ancient Germanic fashion that the Roman army had long ago adopted, and they roared their approval. Constantine, the hostage prince who had fled across half the world, who had no legal claim to power under Diocletian's system, now commanded the legions of Britannia, Gaul, and Hispania. But proclamation by soldiers and actual recognition by the imperial college were different matters entirely. Galerius, the senior Augustus, was furious when news reached him. This was precisely the kind of unilateral action that the Tetrarchy was designed to prevent. Constantine had violated every principle of the succession system, had seized power through military force rather than legitimate appointment. Yet, what could Galerius do? He was in the east, Constantine in the far west, with thousands of miles and the breadth of the empire between them. And Constantine commanded legions, battle-hardened troops loyal to their newly proclaimed Augustus. To challenge him directly meant civil war, and civil war was the very chaos that Diocletian's system had been created to avoid. A compromise was reached, mediated through letters that traveled slowly across the empire. Galerius would recognize Constantine not as Augustus, but as Caesar in the west, subordinate to Severus, who would be elevated to Augustus. Constantine accepted this demotion, at least officially. He took the title of Caesar and minted coins acknowledging Galerius's supremacy. But in his provinces, he ruled as if the title of Augustus were already his. The legions called him Augustus, the people treated him as Augustus, and Constantine himself knew that titles mattered less than power. The compromise proved fragile. Within months, the carefully constructed tetrarchy began to collapse. In Rome, Maxentius, the son of the retired Maximian, staged his own coup, refusing to accept the tax burdens imposed by the new regime. The Praetorian Guard and the Roman people proclaimed him emperor. Severus, that short-lived Augustus, marched against Maxentius and was defeated, eventually murdered. The empire descended once again into the very civil wars that Diocletian had sought to prevent. Multiple claimants fought for supreme power: Galerius in the east, Maxentius in Italy and Africa, Constantine in the west, and various other pretenders who rose and fell like waves against rocks. Constantine navigated these treacherous waters with remarkable skill. He formed an alliance with old Maximian, who had come out of retirement to support his son Maxentius, but soon broke with him. Constantine married Maximian's daughter Fausta in 307, cementing the alliance through that ancient mechanism of bloodlines joined in matrimony. He was now son-in-law to a former Augustus, connected by marriage to the Herculean dynasty that Maximian represented. But Constantine also kept his own counsel, built his own power base, and waited for the right moment. He campaigned successfully against Germanic tribes along the Rhine, securing his northern frontier and building his reputation as a military commander. He reformed the administration of his provinces, showing himself to be not merely a soldier, but a capable governor. These were years of consolidation and preparation. Constantine understood that the Tetrarchy was dead, that the empire would eventually be unified under a single ruler, and that he intended to be that ruler. But he also understood that patience was a virtue, that striking too soon could prove fatal, that the art of empire required knowing when to advance and when to wait. The Gallic provinces that Constantine governed were far from the heart of traditional Roman power, but they possessed their own strengths. These were lands of deep forests and mighty rivers, of Celtic traditions mixing with Roman order, of fierce warriors who had learned to fight in Roman fashion. Here, along the Rhine frontier, Constantine built the foundation of his future empire. He campaigned relentlessly against the Germanic tribes who pressed against the frontier. The Franks, the Alemanni, the Bructeri all felt the weight of Constantine's legions. These were not the grand campaigns that history remembers, not battles that poets celebrated in epic verse. They were the grinding, necessary work of frontier defense, the endless cycle of raid and counter-raid, of punitive expeditions and defensive stands that kept civilization from collapsing into chaos. But through these campaigns, Constantine forged something invaluable, an army loyal to him personally. The soldiers who fought under his command learned to trust his judgment, to believe in his leadership, to see him not as some distant figure appointed by imperial machinery, but as their commander who shared their dangers and their victories. This personal loyalty, this bond between general and soldier, would prove more valuable than any constitutional legitimacy. The political situation remained fluid and treacherous. In 310, Constantine's alliance with Maximian collapsed in spectacular fashion. The old emperor, restless in retirement, attempted to seize power while Constantine was campaigning on the Rhine. He bribed soldiers, claimed that Constantine had died, and attempted to take control of the Western armies. Constantine moved with decisive speed. He rushed back from the frontier, gathered loyal troops, and cornered Maximian in Massilia, modern Marseille. The old emperor was given a choice that was no choice at all: suicide or execution. Maximian chose the former, hanging himself in July of 310. Constantine had ordered the death of his father-in-law the man whose daughter he had married to, cement their alliance. It was a brutal reminder that in the game of empire, sentiment was a luxury no one could afford. The death of Maximian left Constantine in an awkward position. He had built his legitimacy partly on his connection to the Herculean dynasty through marriage to Fausta. Now he had killed the patriarch of that dynasty. He needed a new source of legitimacy, a new narrative to explain his right to rule. The solution came through what would later be called the Apollo Sol vision. Constantine claimed that the god Apollo, identified with Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, had appeared to him in a vision, offering crowns of victory and promising a long reign. Whether this vision was genuine religious experience, political propaganda, or some mixture of both, it served its purpose. Constantine now claimed divine sanction for his rule, a direct connection to the divine that transcended mere constitutional arrangements. He minted coins showing Sol Invictus, the radiant sun god who had become popular among soldiers. He built his legitimacy not on tetrarchic succession, but on divine favor, on military victory, on the loyalty of his legions. He was creating something new, a form of imperial authority that combined traditional Roman elements with new religious claims and military realities. Meanwhile, in Italy, Maxentius had consolidated his position. He controlled Rome itself, that ancient city that remained symbolically vital despite no longer being an administrative capital. He had defeated multiple attempts to overthrow him, had built his own power base, and showed no inclination to acknowledge Constantine's authority. The stage was set for confrontation. Two strong rulers, each controlling substantial territories, each building military power, each claiming legitimacy through different means. The Rhine and the Alps separated them, but that separation could not last forever. Constantine prepared his legions, stockpiled supplies, built alliances, and waited for the moment when he could march into Italy and settle the question of power once and for all. The decision to march on Italy was not made lightly. Constantine commanded perhaps 40,000 soldiers, a respectable force but not overwhelming. Maxentius, entrenched in Rome with the wealth of Italy and Africa at his disposal, could field significantly larger armies. The Alpine passes were defensible, the logistics daunting, and failure would mean not merely defeat but annihilation. Yet Constantine understood that the moment had come. The empire could not sustain multiple competing Augusti indefinitely. One of them would fall, and Constantine had no intention of being the one. In the spring of 312, he gathered his forces and began the march southward. The army crossed the Alps, moving through the passes that had once carried Hannibal's elephants toward Rome. They descended into the Po Valley, and there Constantine won his first victories. The cities of northern Italy, uncertain of Maxentius's staying power and impressed by Constantine's advancing legions, opened their gates. Verona fell after a siege. Milan welcomed him. The momentum was building. But it was as Constantine marched down the Italian peninsula toward Rome itself that something extraordinary occurred, or so the sources tell us. The accounts vary in details but converge on the essential claim. Constantine experienced a vision that would change not only the outcome of the approaching battle, but the course of Western civilization. Lactantius, writing close to the events, reports that Constantine received a dream the night before battle. In this dream, he was commanded to mark the shields of his soldiers with a Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, formed by superimposing the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Eusebius, Constantine's later biographer, tells a more elaborate story. He claims Constantine saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, bearing the inscription "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, you will conquer. The skeptical historian must approach these accounts carefully. They were written by Christians eager to claim Constantine for their faith, to present his conversion as miraculous and complete. Yet something clearly happened during that march toward Rome, something that led Constantine to adopt Christian symbols for what would become the decisive battle of his life. Perhaps it was a genuine vision, a mystical experience of the type that many in the ancient world accepted as real communication with the divine. Perhaps it was a calculated political decision. Constantine had seen during his years in Diocletian's court that Christians, despite persecution, remained stubbornly loyal to their faith. Winning their support might prove strategically valuable. Perhaps it was some combination of both. Spiritual experience interpreted through political calculation. What we know with certainty is this. Constantine ordered the shields of his soldiers painted with the Chi Rho symbol. He marched under a new standard, the labarum, which bore Christian insignia. He told his troops that they fought with divine sanction, that the God of the Christians had promised them victory. For soldiers raised in traditional Roman religion, where one honored whichever god seemed most powerful at any given moment, this was not as strange as it might appear to modern sensibilities. If the Christian God could deliver victory, then honoring that God made perfect military sense. The soldiers painted their shields and marched on Rome. Maxentius, secure within Rome's ancient walls, might have simply waited out Constantine's army. Supplies would eventually run short, disease would weaken the besieging force, and Constantine would have to retreat or face starvation. But Maxentius chose differently. His advisors consulted the Sibylline books, those ancient prophetic texts that Rome had consulted in times of crisis for centuries. The prophecy declared that on that day, the enemy of Rome would perish. Maxentius interpreted this as promising Constantine's destruction. He ordered his forces to march out and meet Constantine in open battle. The location would be just north of Rome, near the Milvian bridge that crossed the Tiber. The date was October 28, 312. As Constantine's army approached the battlefield, the soldiers bearing their marked shields and the labarum standard held high, they might have wondered whether this strange new god would indeed deliver the victory their emperor had promised. The fate of the empire and the fate of Christianity itself hung in the balance of what would happen in the coming hours. Dawn broke over the Tiber on that October morning, revealing the two armies drawn up in battle array. Maxentius had positioned his forces with their backs to the river, a curious choice that suggested either supreme confidence or poor tactical judgment. He had constructed a bridge of boats alongside the ancient Milvian bridge to allow his troops to cross. But this created a bottleneck that would prove fatal. Constantine deployed his forces with the skill learned through years of frontier warfare. His cavalry was positioned on the flanks, his infantry in the center, and he himself took personal command, visible to his troops in the distinctive armor of an imperator. The labarum standard, emblazoned with Christian symbols, stood where his soldiers could see it, a tangible reminder of the divine favor Constantine claimed. The battle opened with skirmishing between cavalry forces, each side probing for weakness. Then Constantine launched his main assault. His veteran troops, hardened by campaigns against Germanic tribes, crashed into Maxentius's lines with disciplined ferocity. The fighting was brutal and close, shields locked together, swords thrusting between gaps, men screaming and dying in the press of combat. Maxentius's troops, many of them recently recruited or drawn from the Praetorian Guard, whose primary experience was urban peacekeeping rather than frontier war, began to buckle under the pressure. The veterans of Constantine's legions drove forward relentlessly, their shields marked with the Chi Rho, pushing deeper into enemy formations. Then the Maxentian lines broke. What had been organized resistance dissolved into chaos as units disintegrated and men fled toward the river. The narrow bridges became killing grounds. Soldiers fought desperately to cross, crushing their comrades, pushing men into the water. The Tiber, swollen with autumn rains, became a graveyard. Maxentius himself was caught in the crush. Whether he was pushed or jumped attempting to escape across the bridge of boats, the sources vary. What is certain is that he drowned, his body weighted down by imperial armor, pulled under by the river's current. When his corpse was recovered the next day, Constantine had it decapitated. The head was paraded through the streets of Rome on a spear, a brutal but effective announcement of regime change. Constantine's army had achieved total victory. The casualties on Maxentius's side were catastrophic, on Constantine's side relatively light. The soldiers who had fought under the Christian symbols believed they had witnessed divine intervention. The Christian God, it seemed, had indeed delivered the victory their emperor promised. On October 29th, Constantine entered Rome in triumph. But this was a different kind of triumph than Rome had seen before. He did not ascend to the capital to perform the traditional sacrifices to Jupiter. He did not participate fully in the pagan ceremonies that had marked military victories for 1,000 years. Instead, he showed marked favor to the Christian community of Rome, a community that had suffered terribly under the recent persecutions. The Senate, always pragmatic, declared Maxentius a tyrant and enemy of Rome. They erected the Arch of Constantine, which still stands today, commemorating his victory. Interestingly, the arch's decorations carefully avoid explicit Christian imagery. It speaks of the prompting of the divinity rather than naming Christ specifically. Constantine was moving carefully, not yet ready to fully break with traditional Roman religion, but clearly signaling a new direction. The victory at Milvian Bridge was militarily decisive, but its consequences transcended military matters. Constantine now controlled the western half of the Roman Empire. He had defeated Maxentius fighting under Christian symbols. He had entered Rome as a ruler who showed unprecedented favor to Christians. The question was no longer whether Christianity would survive persecution, but what role it would play in an empire where the emperor himself seemed to be its patron. For the Christian communities scattered across the empire, the news must have seemed almost incredible. A decade earlier, they had faced systematic persecution. Now the Master of the West had won his greatest victory carrying their symbols. The age of martyrdom was ending. Something new, something unprecedented was beginning. Constantine did not linger long in Rome. The city was symbolically important, the ancient heart of empire, but it was no longer the center of power. The real work of consolidating control over the western provinces required his presence elsewhere. In early 313, he traveled north to meet with Licinius, the Augustus who controlled the Balkans and had, through careful maneuvering, survived the chaos that had consumed so many others. The meeting took place in Mediolanum, Milan, in February 313. It was ostensibly a diplomatic conference between the two remaining Augusti in the empire. Galerius had died in 311, leaving Licinius as senior Augustus in the east, while Constantine controlled the west. The empire was now divided between two strong rulers, and the question was whether they would cooperate or collide. The meeting was sealed, as such meetings often were, with a marriage alliance. Licinius wed Constantia, Constantine's half-sister, binding the two Augusti together through blood and law. But the most significant outcome of the Milan conference was not the marriage, but a declaration of religious policy that would forever be known as the Edict of Milan. The document was not technically an edict, and it may not have been issued from Milan itself. The sources are unclear. What matters is that Constantine and Licinius jointly proclaimed a new policy toward Christianity and religious freedom generally. The text, preserved by Lactantius and Eusebius, is remarkable for its clarity and breadth. Christians were to enjoy complete freedom of worship. All confiscated church property was to be restored without compensation to current holders. Other religions were also granted tolerance. This was not exclusively a Christian measure, but a general proclamation of religious liberty. The language spoke of allowing everyone to follow whatever religion they chose, so that whatever divinity dwells in heaven might be favorable to the emperors and their subjects. This represented a revolutionary shift in Roman policy. For centuries, Rome had been fundamentally a pagan empire. The emperor held the title Pontifex Maximus, high priest of the state religion. Public life was intertwined with sacrifices to the traditional gods. Christianity, with its exclusive claims and refusal to honor other deities, had been seen as atheistic, antisocial, a threat to the very fabric that bound Roman society together. Diocletian's great persecution had been an attempt to eliminate this threat once and for all. Churches had been destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned, ordinary believers forced to choose between their faith and their lives. Thousands had chosen martyrdom. The persecutions had failed to eradicate Christianity, but they had driven it underground, made it a religion of whispers and hidden gatherings. Now, barely a decade later, the situation had completely reversed. Christianity was not merely tolerated but actively favored. Constantine began returning confiscated property on an enormous scale. Churches that had been demolished were rebuilt, often with imperial funds. Clergy were granted exemptions from certain civic duties and taxes. Christians who had lost positions during the persecution were restored to their posts. The change was staggering in its speed and scope. Christian communities that had met in secret in house churches and catacombs now found themselves able to worship openly. Bishops who had hidden their identity now corresponded with the emperor himself. The faith that had been born in a stable in Bethlehem, that had been persecuted by Nero and Diocletian, that had seemed destined to remain a marginal Eastern cult, suddenly found itself with imperial patronage. But the Edict of Milan did more than just end persecution. It established a principle of religious tolerance that was radical for its time. While Constantine clearly favored Christianity, the edict granted freedom to all religions. Pagans could continue their traditional worship. Jews maintained their synagogues. The diversity of religious expression that characterized the Roman Empire was, at least officially, to be protected. Constantine's motives, as always, were complex. He may have believed genuinely in the Christian God, convinced that his victory at Milvian Bridge proved divine favor. He may have seen political advantage in supporting a well-organized religion with passionate adherents throughout the empire. He may have sought to harness Christianity's moral authority and organizational structure for his own purposes. Likely, all these factors intermingled. What is certain is that the Edict of Milan marked a turning point in history. The age of persecution was over. The age of Christian empire was beginning. With Maxentius dead and Italy under his control, Constantine set about consolidating his position as Augustus of the West. He now ruled a vast territory: Britannia, Gaul, Hispania, Italy, and Africa. This was roughly half the Roman Empire, and Constantine intended to govern it effectively. His first concern was military. The frontiers required constant attention, and Constantine proved himself a capable commander. He campaigned along the Rhine against Germanic tribes who saw the civil wars as opportunities for raiding. He strengthened frontier fortifications, reorganized military commands, and ensured the legions remained loyal to him personally. His army became the most formidable military force in the empire. But Constantine understood that power required more than military strength. He needed administrative competence, economic stability, and at least the appearance of legitimacy. He retained much of Diocletian's administrative structure while adapting it to his own needs. He reformed the currency, introducing the solidus, a gold coin of consistent weight and purity that would remain the standard for centuries. Economic stability began to return to regions that had suffered through decades of debasement and inflation. In Rome itself, Constantine's position was delicate. The Senate represented the old aristocracy, families whose lineages stretched back to the Republic, who had seen emperors come and go and believed themselves eternal. They were pagan to their core, steeped in traditions that made Rome's identity inseparable from its ancient gods. Constantine needed their cooperation but could not entirely trust them. He handled this carefully, showing respect for senatorial privilege while making clear that real power rested with him. He commissioned public works that brought employment and grain. He staged games and spectacles, maintaining the bread and circuses that kept the urban population content. He built Christian churches but did not attack pagan temples. He walked a careful line between old and new, pagan and Christian, senatorial tradition and military reality. The massive arch of Constantine, completed around 315, exemplified this balancing act. It celebrated his victory at Milvian Bridge but did so in carefully ambiguous terms. The inscription spoke of his victory through the prompting of the divinity, leaving unclear which divinity was meant. The arch's decorations included reliefs stolen from monuments to earlier emperors, connecting Constantine to the imperial tradition while celebrating his own achievements. Meanwhile, Constantine began building the institutional framework that would support a Christian empire. He funded church construction on an unprecedented scale. In Rome, he commissioned the original St. Peter's Basilica, built over what was believed to be the Apostles' Tomb. He constructed the Lateran Basilica, which would serve as the Cathedral of Rome. In the Holy Land, he would eventually sponsor churches at sites associated with Christ's life. He also involved himself in church affairs in ways that would set precedents for centuries. When disputes arose about theology or church governance, Constantine intervened, convening councils, mediating disputes, and enforcing decisions. The emperor was becoming not merely a patron of Christianity but its protector, and in some sense, its director. This created tensions that would echo through history. What was the proper relationship between imperial power and church authority? Could the emperor dictate theology? Did bishops serve at imperial pleasure? These questions would generate conflicts for centuries. But in 313 they were only beginning to emerge. For now, Constantine focused on building his power base, developing loyalty, creating the administrative and military structures that would allow him to govern effectively. He had won the West through military victory. Now he had to prove he could actually rule it. And always, in the back of his mind, was the awareness that the empire remained divided. Licinius controlled the East, wealthy, populous, culturally sophisticated. The accommodation reached at Milan was pragmatic, not permanent. Both Augusti understood that eventually one of them would seek to unite the empire under sole rule. The only question was when. The peace between Constantine and Licinius was always fragile, built on mutual necessity rather than trust. For several years after Milan, the two Augusti maintained the appearance of cooperation. They ruled their respective halves of the empire, exchanged diplomatic courtesies, and avoided open conflict. But beneath the surface, tensions accumulated like pressure building behind a dam. The first cracks appeared in 314, barely a year after Milan. The immediate cause was a dispute over territories in the Balkans, always a contested region between East and West. But the deeper issue was that two strong rulers could not indefinitely share an empire. Constantine's western domains were wealthy and militarily powerful. Licinius's eastern territories were even wealthier, controlling the trade routes to Asia and the prosperous cities of Egypt and Syria. The First War erupted in 316. Constantine invaded Licinius's territory, and the two armies met in the Balkans. At Cibalae in modern-day Croatia, Constantine won a decisive victory. His legions, hardened by years of frontier warfare, proved superior to Licinius's forces. Licinius retreated eastward, gathering reinforcements, and the armies clashed again at the Campus Ardiensis. This second battle was less conclusive, but Constantine held the advantage. Yet neither side could achieve total victory. The logistics of campaigning across such vast distances, the need to maintain frontier defenses against external enemies, the risk of internal rebellion, all these factors argued for compromise. A peace was negotiated. Constantine gained control of most of the Balkans, significantly expanding his territory. Licinius retained the wealthy eastern provinces. Each Augustus appointed a Caesar to assist in governing. Constantine elevated his son Crispus, and Licinius appointed Licinianus, his young son by Constantia. The peace held for nearly 8 years, but it was a cold peace. The two Augusti watched each other suspiciously across their shared frontier. Constantine continued to strengthen his military, reform his administration, and build his power base. Licinius did the same in the east, but something else was happening that made reconciliation increasingly impossible. The two Augusti were moving in opposite religious directions. Constantine had become ever more openly Christian. He commissioned churches, granted privileges to clergy, involved himself in theological disputes. Licinius, meanwhile, began to view Christianity with growing suspicion. Perhaps he saw it as Constantine's religion, a potential fifth column within his own territories. Perhaps he genuinely believed in the traditional gods and saw Christianity as a threat to Roman identity. Whatever his motives, Licinius began imposing restrictions on Christians in his domains. Churches could not be built. Christian meetings were limited. Some clergy faced harassment. It was not Diocletian's systematic persecution, but it was oppression nonetheless, and it gave Constantine a perfect pretext for intervention. Constantine presented himself as the defender of Christians oppressed by a tyrant. He gathered his forces, now including substantial naval power, and prepared for the final confrontation. In 324, he launched a two-pronged assault. His army marched eastward through the Balkans, while his fleet sailed toward the Hellespont. The decisive battle came at Adrianople in Thrace. Constantine commanded approximately 130,000 soldiers against Licinius's force of perhaps 165,000, despite being outnumbered. Constantine's tactical brilliance and the superior training of his veterans won the day. Licinius's army was shattered, and he fled toward Byzantium, that ancient Greek city on the Bosporus. Constantine pursued relentlessly. His fleet, commanded by his son Crispus, defeated Licinius's navy in the Hellespont. With control of the seas lost and his army in disarray, Licinius crossed into Asia. But Constantine would not relent. The final battle came at Chrysopolis, across the Bosporus from Byzantium. On September 18, 324, Constantine's forces again proved superior. Licinius's army was destroyed. Licinius himself surrendered, hoping for mercy for himself and his family. Constantine's wife Constantia pleaded for her half-brother's life. Initially, Constantine seemed inclined toward clemency. Licinius was allowed to retire to Thessalonica under guard, his purple stripped away, but his life spared. It did not last. Within a year, Licinius was dead, executed on charges of plotting rebellion. Whether the charges were genuine or fabricated remains debated, but the result was clear. Constantine now ruled the entire Roman Empire alone. For the first time since Diocletian had divided power decades earlier, the empire was united under a single Augustus. The long civil wars were finally over. Constantine, at age 52, stood as sole master of the Roman world. Every legion answered to him, every province acknowledged his authority, every frontier was his to defend or expand as he chose. The question now was what he would do with this unprecedented power. Standing on the hills of Byzantium in 324, surveying the narrow strait where Europe and Asia almost touched, Constantine made a decision that would echo through millennia. Here, on this strategic peninsula where the Bosporus met the Sea of Marmara, he would build a new capital for the Roman Empire. Not just another city, but a new Rome, Nova Roma, though it would forever bear his name, Constantinople. The choice was brilliant strategically. Byzantium commanded the waterways between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, controlling trade routes that connected the empire's richest provinces. It stood at the junction of Europe and Asia, a bridge between worlds. The site was naturally defensible, surrounded on three sides by water, approachable by land only through a narrow isthmus that could be easily fortified. From here, an emperor could respond quickly to threats on either the Danube or the Euphrates frontier. But Constantine's vision went beyond mere strategy. He intended to create something unprecedented, a Christian capital for a Christian empire. Rome, for all its grandeur, was saturated with paganism. Every street held temples to the old gods. Every public space was consecrated to Jupiter or Mars or Venus. The Senate was dominated by pagan aristocrats who saw Christianity as at best a regrettable innovation, at worst a dangerous corruption of Roman virtue. Constantinople would be different from its inception. It would rise as a Christian city, built under Christian auspices, dedicated to the Christian God. There would be churches rather than temples, relics of saints rather than statues of pagan deities, the cross rather than the eagle as the supreme symbol. The construction was monumental in scale. Constantine mobilized resources from across the empire. Architects, engineers, and laborers converged on Byzantium by the thousands. The city walls were extended, encompassing a much larger area than the old Greek town. A hippodrome was built, modeled on Rome's Circus Maximus, where the emperor could display his munificence through chariot races and games. An imperial palace rose on the Acropolis, magnificent in its scale and decoration. Public buildings, forums, and colonnaded streets transformed the landscape. Constantine brought artworks from across the empire to beautify his new capital. Statues, columns, precious stones. Some of these were pagan artifacts repurposed for Christian contexts, the old gods converted into mere decoration for the new order. The famous serpent column from Delphi, commemorating Greek victory over the Persians 800 years earlier, was installed in the hippodrome, stripped of its religious significance and made merely ornamental. Churches were built on a scale that proclaimed Christianity's new status. The Church of Hagia Irene, Holy Peace, rose as one of the city's principal places of worship. The Church of the Holy Apostles was designed as Constantine's eventual burial place, where he would rest among the apostles themselves, claiming in death a spiritual authority to match his temporal power. The construction took 6 years. Thousands of workers labored to realize Constantine's vision. The cost was enormous, draining imperial treasuries, but Constantine was building not just for his own reign, but for eternity. He was creating a capital that would embody his vision of what the Roman Empire should become. On May 11, 330, the city was formally dedicated. The ceremonies mixed Christian and traditional Roman elements in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Christian bishops blessed the city, but games were held in the hippodrome, and coins were minted showing Constantine alongside the Tyche of the city. Though now this fortune goddess was Christianized, her pagan associations muted. Constantinople was granted privileges that elevated it above all other cities, save Rome itself. The Senate was expanded to include a Constantinopolitan branch. Grain was provided free to residents, just as in Rome. The greatest families of the empire were encouraged to build palaces in the new capital. The symbolism was unmistakable. Constantine was not merely adding another administrative center to the empire. He was shifting the empire's center of gravity eastward, away from the pagan aristocracy of Rome toward a new Christian elite. He was creating a capital free from the weight of centuries of pagan tradition, where Christianity could flourish without constantly negotiating with the ghosts of Jupiter and Mars. The old Greek town of Byzantium disappeared, swallowed by Constantine's vision. In its place rose Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the new Rome. It would stand for more than 1,000 years, surviving the fall of the Western Empire, becoming the heart of what historians would call the Byzantine Empire, serving as Christendom's bulwark against Islamic expansion, and finally falling only in 1453 to Ottoman cannons. But in 330, as Constantine surveyed his completed city, all of that lay in the future. For now, he had achieved something remarkable. He had built a capital worthy of his vision, a Christian Rome to govern a Christian empire. Unity was proving more difficult than victory. Constantine had conquered the empire, but he discovered that Christianity itself was fragmenting into bitter factions. The disputes were not about whether to worship Christ, but about who exactly Christ was, questions that might seem abstract, but carried implications that threatened to tear apart. The very church Constantine had elevated, the controversy centered on a priest from Alexandria named Arius. He taught that Christ, while divine and the Son of God, was nevertheless created by the Father and therefore subordinate to him. There was a time, Arius argued, when the Son was not. This seemed to Arius logical and scriptural, preserving the absolute uniqueness of God the Father. But to many other Christians, Arianism was heresy of the most dangerous kind. If Christ was created, then he was not truly God. If he was not truly God, then the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection lost their salvific power. Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, condemned Arius's teachings. But Arius had supporters, including powerful bishops. The Eastern churches split into bitter factions. Constantine watched these disputes with growing alarm. He had not elevated Christianity to prominence only to watch it self-destruct through theological infighting. He wrote letters urging reconciliation, treating the dispute as a minor matter that reasonable men should be able to resolve. But the theologians would not be reconciled. The issue was too fundamental. So Constantine made a momentous decision. He would convene a council of all the bishops of the church, bringing them together under imperial auspices to settle the matter definitively. This had never been done before. Previous church councils had been regional affairs. Constantine was proposing something unprecedented, an ecumenical council, representing the universal church with the emperor himself presiding. The location chosen was Nicaea, a city in Bithynia conveniently close to Constantine's new capital. The date was set for May 325. Constantine offered to pay the traveling expenses of bishops from across the empire. He placed the imperial transportation system at their disposal. Hundreds of bishops converged on Nicaea. The sources claim 318, though the exact number is disputed. On May 20th, Constantine entered the council chamber. The bishops rose as the emperor appeared, dressed in purple and gold, blazing with imperial majesty. Many of these men bore scars from the persecutions, eyes put out, limbs crippled by torture, bodies broken by years of imprisonment. Now they stood in the presence of an emperor who honored rather than persecuted them. The reversal must have seemed miraculous. Constantine addressed the assembly, speaking in Latin that was translated into Greek. He urged unity, harmony, and brotherly love. He presented himself not as a theologian but as a servant of God, seeking to foster peace in the church. But his presence alone shaped the proceedings. This was an emperor used to command, and bishops understood that defying imperial will came with consequences. The debates were fierce. Arius defended his position, arguing from scripture. His opponents, led by the young deacon Athanasius of Alexandria, countered with equal passion. The question was fundamental. Was Christ homoousios, of the same substance as the Father, or was he similar but distinct? After weeks of debate, a creed emerged, what would become known as the Nicene Creed. It affirmed that Christ was begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. The language was carefully chosen to exclude Arian interpretation. Christ was not a creation but was eternally begotten, sharing fully in the divine nature of the Father. The vast majority of bishops signed the creed. Only a handful, including Arius himself, refused. Constantine exiled the holdouts, making clear that religious unity was now state policy. The emperor, who had ended persecution, now employed imperial power to enforce orthodoxy. The Council of Nicaea did more than settle a theological dispute. It established a precedent that would shape Christianity for centuries. The emperor had authority to convene councils, to enforce their decisions, to exile those who dissented. Church and state were becoming intertwined in ways that would have been unimaginable decades earlier. Constantine also involved himself in more practical matters at Nicaea. The council standardized the date of Easter, ending regional variations that had caused confusion. It established rules for ordaining bishops and organizing church hierarchy. It addressed questions of penance and readmission of those who had lapsed during persecutions. When the council concluded, Constantine hosted a magnificent banquet celebrating both the council's completion and the 20th anniversary of his own reign. The bishops dined with the emperor, experiencing imperial favor that must have seemed impossibly distant during the dark days of persecution. In the years following Nicaea, Constantine stood at the absolute zenith of his power. He was sole ruler of a reunited empire, master of the largest military force in the known world, patron of a church that was rapidly becoming the empire's dominant religion. At age 54, he had achieved what no emperor since Augustus had managed: unchallenged supremacy over the entire Roman world. His court at Constantinople reflected this unprecedented authority. The ceremonies grew ever more elaborate, drawing on both Roman tradition and Eastern monarchical practices. Visitors prostrated themselves before the emperor. Access to the imperial presence was carefully controlled through layers of chamberlains and officials. Constantine presented himself as God's representative on earth, chosen by divine providence to rule and to protect the true faith. The empire's economy stabilized under his monetary reforms. The solidus, Constantine's gold coin, became the standard of international trade. Its weight and purity were carefully maintained, making it trusted from Britain to Persia. This economic stability, after decades of debasement and inflation, brought prosperity to the empire's commercial classes and filled imperial coffers. Constantine's building program extended beyond Constantinople. Churches rose across the empire, often built on sites associated with Christian martyrs or biblical events. In Rome, he commissioned not only St. Peter's Basilica, but also churches dedicated to St. Paul and other apostles. In the Holy Land, his mother Helena, now Augusta, and deeply involved in Christian causes, supervised the construction of churches at Bethlehem and the Holy Sepulchre. These buildings were more than houses of worship. They were statements of imperial ideology, proclaiming through stone and gold that the Roman Empire had become Christian. The architectural language borrowed from Roman imperial basilicas, long halls with apses, columns, and rich decoration, but repurposed them for Christian liturgy. The emperor who built temples became the emperor who built churches. Constantine's legal reforms reflected his Christian commitments. He issued laws restricting crucifixion as a punishment, perhaps out of respect for Christ's death. He granted new rights to slaves and improved protections for children. Sunday was declared a day of rest for most workers, a nod to Christian practice, though justified in terms that pagans could accept by reference to the sun god. These reforms were modest by modern standards, but they represented the first steps toward infusing Roman law with Christian values. Yet Constantine remained in many ways a traditional Roman emperor. He continued to hold the title Pontifex Maximus, high priest of the pagan state religion. His coins, while increasingly featuring Christian symbols, also depicted Sol Invictus. He maintained the imperial cult in provinces where Christianity had made little headway. He understood that the empire's population remained predominantly pagan and that pushing too hard, too fast, risked provoking backlash. His military remained supreme. The frontiers were secure, the legions loyal, potential rivals crushed or cowed into submission. Constantine had reorganized the army, creating mobile field forces, comitatenses, that could respond quickly to threats while maintaining border troops, limitanae, for routine frontier defense. This two-tier system would shape Roman military organization for the next 2 centuries. Constantine's family surrounded him, prominent in imperial iconography. His mother Helena enjoyed unprecedented influence for an emperor's mother. His sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, were elevated to Caesars, each governing portions of the empire under their father's supreme authority. His wife Fausta bore the title Augusta. The dynasty seemed secure. Standing in his palace in Constantinople, surveying an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, Constantine might have been forgiven for believing he had achieved something eternal. He had united the empire through military genius. He had secured it through administrative competence. He had transformed it through religious revolution. He had built a new capital to embody his vision. The future seemed to belong to Constantine and his heirs. Yet shadows were gathering, visible to those who looked carefully. The theological peace imposed at Nicaea remained fragile, with Arian sympathies still strong in parts of the church. Family tensions simmered beneath the surface of imperial harmony, and Constantine himself, now in his 50s, bore the weight of years and the accumulated stress of decades of warfare and governance. The apex of power is also, by definition, the point from which decline begins. The year 326 began with celebrations but ended in blood and mystery. Constantine, at the height of his power, presided over an empire that seemed secure and a dynasty that appeared unshakable. But within the gilded halls of the imperial palace, tensions had been building, jealousies, suspicions, and rivalries that festered in the hothouse atmosphere of absolute power. Crispus, Constantine's eldest son from his first marriage to Minervina, had distinguished himself brilliantly. He had commanded the fleet that destroyed Licinius's navy in the Hellespont. He had proven himself capable in administration and popular with both soldiers and civilians. At perhaps 30 years old, he stood, as heir apparent, the obvious successor to his father's throne. His military victories and administrative competence made him indispensable. But Crispus's very competence may have been his undoing. Fausta, Constantine's second wife, had borne 3 sons of her own. If Crispus succeeded Constantine, her children would be subordinate to their half-brother. Ambition and maternal instinct are powerful forces, and Fausta had access to Constantine's ear in ways that few others did. What happened in 326 remains shrouded in conflicting accounts and deliberate obscurity. The official records were later scrubbed, names erased, references deleted. Later, Christian historians, embarrassed by the events, offered explanations that may have been speculation rather than knowledge. But the basic facts are undeniable. Crispus was arrested, charged with treason, and executed at Pola in Istria. The charges against him remain unclear. Some sources whisper of conspiracy, of plotting to seize power prematurely. Other accounts, written later, claim something far more scandalous, that Fausta had accused Crispus of attempting to seduce her, that she had painted him as a would-be Hippolytus to her Phaedra, the lustful stepson threatening his father's marriage bed. Whether this accusation was true, invented by Fausta, or fabricated by later writers seeking to explain the inexplicable, we cannot know. What we know is that Constantine, who had shown mercy to defeated enemies, who had negotiated carefully through decades of political complexity, ordered the execution of his own eldest son. The prince who had won naval victories for his father died in disgrace, his memory condemned, his achievements erased from official records, but the tragedy did not end there. Within months, perhaps weeks, Fausta herself was dead. The official account claimed illness, but the manner of her death suggested something more sinister. She was found dead in an overheated bath, essentially boiled alive. Whether this was accident, suicide, or execution, the sources carefully avoid saying, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Had Constantine discovered that Fausta's accusations against Crispus were false? Had his mother Helena, who had loved Crispus, convinced him of his son's innocence too late? Had Fausta's scheming, if scheming it was, been uncovered? Or had Constantine simply decided that the woman who had caused his son's death must herself die? The palace fell silent on the matter. No official explanation was given. Fausta's name, like Crispus's, was systematically erased from monuments and inscriptions. Later statues showed Constantine with his 3 remaining sons, but neither Crispus nor Fausta appeared. It was as if they had never existed, as if 326 had been a year like any other. But the psychological toll on Constantine must have been immense. He had killed his own son, either justly if Crispus was truly guilty, or unjustly if he had been deceived. He had then killed or allowed the killing of his wife. 2 people who should have been closest to him were dead by his order or his negligence. The blood was on his hands. Helena, Constantine's mother, left for the Holy Land shortly afterward. Perhaps she could no longer bear to remain in Constantinople, scene of such horrors. Perhaps Constantine sent her away, needing distance from her grief and potential recriminations. She would spend her remaining years in pilgrimage, seeking holy sites, searching for relics including, legend claims, the true cross itself. The executions of 326 cast a shadow over Constantine's remaining years. The emperor, who had united the empire, who had elevated Christianity, who had built Constantinople, was also the emperor who had destroyed his own family. The sources suggest he was tormented by guilt, particularly if he had indeed been deceived about Crispus's guilt. Some Christian writers later claimed that Constantine's conversion deepened after 326, that he sought, through religious devotion, to atone for familial murder. The tragedy revealed something essential about the nature of imperial power. Constantine could command legions, build cities, convene church councils, and reshape the religious landscape of civilization. But he could not escape the human passions, jealousy, suspicion, rage, that destroyed families whether in palaces or peasant huts. Absolute power had not brought absolute wisdom. The man who changed the world could not save his own son. In the palace at Constantinople, the emperor aged perceptibly after 326. The vigor of his middle years gave way to a weariness that no amount of imperial splendor could conceal. He had climbed to the summit of earthly power and found that the air there was thin and cold, offering little comfort to a man haunted by what he had done to those who should have been dearest to him. As the decade of the 330s progressed, Constantine's attention turned increasingly toward the east, toward the ancient enemy that had challenged Rome since the days of Crassus and Mark Antony. Persia, now ruled by the Sassanid dynasty, represented both a military threat and an opportunity for glory. Shapur II, the Persian king of kings, had come to power as an infant and now, grown to manhood, pressed aggressively against Rome's eastern frontier. The conflict had deep roots. The border between the Roman and Persian empires had been contested for centuries, shifting back and forth across Mesopotamia and Armenia. Cities changed hands, fortresses were besieged and relieved, and both empires poured resources into maintaining their positions. Under Constantine's rule, tensions had been relatively manageable, but Shapur's increasingly aggressive stance suggested that a major confrontation was inevitable. Constantine saw in a Persian campaign the opportunity to cap his reign with the kind of military glory that Augustus and Trajan had achieved. He was now approaching his mid-60s, but the prospect of eastern conquest seemed to energize him. He began assembling a massive army, drawing troops from across the empire. The logistics alone were staggering, moving tens of thousands of soldiers, along with supplies, siege equipment, and the administrative apparatus needed to support such an expedition, across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. But there was another dimension to Constantine's interest in Persia beyond mere conquest. The Persian Empire contained Christian communities, descendants of the earliest evangelization, who now faced persecution under Shapur. The Persian king, suspicious of a religion associated with his Roman enemies, had begun oppressing Christians in his realm. Constantine wrote letters to Shapur presenting himself as protector of Christians everywhere, warning the Persian king against persecuting those who worshipped the true God. These letters were remarkable documents. Constantine addressed Shapur as a fellow monarch, but also as someone in need of enlightenment about Christianity's truth. He testified to his own faith, described his victories as gifts from the Christian God, and suggested that Persia would prosper if its ruler showed favor to Christians. The tone mixed diplomatic courtesy with religious instruction and implicit threat. Shapur's response, if he sent one, has not survived, but his actions spoke clearly. Persecution of Persian Christians intensified. This gave Constantine both a moral justification for war and a propaganda advantage. He would march east not merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator, defending the faithful against tyranny. Constantine spent months in detailed preparation. He studied maps of the region, consulted with officers who had served on the eastern frontier, and made careful logistical calculations. The campaign would require crossing the Euphrates, fighting through Mesopotamia, and potentially besieging the great Persian cities. It would be the most ambitious military operation since Trajan's Parthian campaign 2 centuries earlier. There were dreams of going even further. Some accounts suggest Constantine imagined himself as a new Alexander who had conquered Persia and reached India. He spoke of wanting to be baptized in the River Jordan, combining military expedition with pilgrimage. The practical soldier and the Christian emperor merged in these visions, seeing conquest and conversion as complementary goals. The army gathered at Constantinople and began moving eastward in early 337. Constantine rode with them, though he was no longer the vigorous warrior who had fought at Milvian Bridge. Age and the accumulated weight of decades of rule had taken their toll. But ambition still burned bright, and the prospect of one final great campaign seemed to revive something of his old energy. The eastern frontier awaited, and beyond it, the ancient kingdom of Persia. Constantine imagined himself entering Persian cities in triumph, liberating Christian communities, perhaps even reaching Jerusalem as a conquering emperor pilgrim. The campaign would vindicate his reign, demonstrate divine favor one final time, and secure his legacy as the greatest of Roman emperors. But destiny, that forced the Romans called fatum, had other plans. The journey that began as a campaign of conquest would end very differently. Constantine rode east toward glory, but found instead the final appointment that awaits all men, emperors, and peasants alike. The Persian campaign would be fought not by Constantine, but by his sons, and the dreams of eastern conquest would dissolve like morning mist under the Anatolian sun. Throughout his reign, Constantine occupied a peculiar religious position. He was Christianity's greatest patron, the emperor who had ended persecution and elevated the church to unprecedented prominence. He built churches, convened councils, involved himself in theological disputes, and presented himself as chosen by God to lead both empire and church. Yet he was never baptized. This was not unusual by the standards of his age. Many Christians delayed baptism until late in life, sometimes until their deathbeds. The reasoning was theological. Baptism washed away sins, but sins committed after baptism could be more difficult to expiate. For someone like Constantine, whose position required making harsh decisions, executing rivals, waging war, imposing capital punishment, the moral burden was heavy. Better perhaps to wait, to accumulate the inevitable stains of imperial rule, and then wash them all away in a final baptism before death. But Constantine's situation was more complex than most delayed baptisms. He continued to hold the title Pontifex Maximus, high priest of the traditional Roman religion. While he rarely participated in pagan ceremonies personally, and often sent representatives to perform sacrifices required by his office, he never formally renounced the position. The old gods of Rome received his official recognition even as he showered Christianity with favor. His coins reflected this duality. Some bore Christian symbols, the Chi-Rho, the Labarum, Christian inscriptions. Others showed Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, or victory, or other traditional Roman iconography. Constantine seemed to exist in both religious worlds simultaneously, Christian in conviction but Roman in practice, pointing toward a Christian future while maintaining connections to the pagan past. This balancing act made political sense. The empire's population remained predominantly pagan, particularly in the countryside and in the West. The senatorial aristocracy of Rome was deeply conservative, attached to traditions that stretched back centuries. The army, while increasingly accepting of Christianity, still included many who honored Mars and Mithras. An emperor who broke too openly with tradition risked alienating powerful constituencies. Yet there was likely something more personal in Constantine's religious ambiguity. He had witnessed Diocletian's persecution as a young man. He had seen Christians tortured and killed for their faith. Then he had experienced what he understood as divine intervention at Milvian Bridge, had won impossible victories under Christian symbols, had felt himself guided by a power greater than Rome's traditional gods. But he had also killed his son and his wife. He had ordered executions, waged civil wars, and made decisions that sent thousands to their deaths. He had accumulated the kind of moral burden that even an emperor might find difficult to bear. Perhaps baptism represented not just theological cleansing, but psychological absolution, a final washing away of accumulated guilt. Constantine also grappled with theological questions that the Church itself was still working through. What exactly happened in baptism? How complete was the forgiveness? Could an emperor, steeped in the violence inherent to ruling, truly enter the Church without hypocrisy? These questions lacked clear answers in the 4th century, and Constantine's reluctance to take the final step may have reflected genuine spiritual uncertainty rather than mere political calculation. His mother Helena had no such hesitations. She embraced Christianity fully, undertook pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and according to tradition, discovered the true cross on which Christ had been crucified. She built churches, endowed monasteries, and lived her final years in devout Christian practice. Perhaps her example influenced Constantine, showing him a path from worldly power to spiritual devotion. Yet Constantine waited. Through the years following Nicaea, through the tragedies of 326, through the building of Constantinople and the reorganization of the empire, he remained unbaptized. He attended Christian services, corresponded with bishops, enforced church decisions, and presented himself as Christianity's imperial protector. But the final, irrevocable step, the baptism that would fully incorporate him into the Christian community, remained ahead, deferred until the time was right. That time Constantine seemed to sense would come at the end. When he had completed his earthly tasks, when the burden of empire was about to be lifted from his shoulders, when death approached and the world beyond beckoned, then he would receive baptism. He would enter the church fully only as he prepared to leave the world entirely, timing the sacrament to ensure that no post-baptismal sins would stain his soul before meeting the God he had served, however imperfectly, throughout his reign. Spring came to Constantinople in 337, but Constantine would not see another summer. The great army he had assembled for the Persian campaign waited, but their emperor grew increasingly ill. What began as fatigue deepened into something more serious. Constantine, now 65 years old, felt the strength draining from his body, felt the weight of mortality pressing upon him in ways that even decades of warfare had never imposed. He attempted to continue preparations for the Eastern expedition, but his body refused to cooperate. The vigor that had carried him through countless campaigns, through civil wars and frontier battles, through the building of cities and the reshaping of an empire, was finally exhausted. Constantine recognized what was happening. He had seen death often enough on battlefields to recognize its approach in the mirror. He left Constantinople, perhaps hoping that travel might restore his health, perhaps understanding that he needed to reach a place where he could receive baptism before the end came. The imperial party moved slowly westward along the coast of the Sea of Marmara toward Nicomedia, that city where Constantine had spent his youth in Diocletian's court. There was a symmetry in this, returning to the place where his education in power had begun, now at the moment when all earthly power was slipping from his grasp at Nicomedia. Constantine finally made the decision he had deferred for decades. He called for Christian clergy and announced his intention to receive baptism. The moment had arrived, the final threshold between his old life and whatever lay beyond. He would enter the church completely, would wash away in sacred water the accumulated sins of a lifetime that had included triumph and tragedy, glory and guilt. The bishop who performed the baptism was Eusebius of Nicomedia, notably a bishop with Arian sympathies, despite the Council of Nicaea's condemnation of Arianism. Whether this choice reflected Constantine's own theological leanings, the practical reality of which bishops were available, or simply chance, historians have debated for centuries. What matters is that Constantine, finally and fully, entered the Christian community as a baptized believer. After the baptism, Constantine put aside the purple robes of empire. He dressed in white, the traditional garment of the newly baptized, signaling his transformation from emperor to Christian. In those final days, he was both and neither, still technically Augustus, but no longer exercising power, no longer concerned with the machinery of rule that had consumed his adult life. On May 22, 337, in a suburban villa near Nicomedia, Constantine died. He was 65 years old. He had ruled for 31 years, longer than all but a handful of Roman emperors. He had united an empire, built a capital, transformed a religion from persecuted sect to imperial church, and changed the course of Western civilization. Now, dressed in white baptismal robes, he departed the world he had reshaped so profoundly. Constantine's body was prepared for the journey back to Constantinople with all the ceremony befitting an emperor. Dressed once again in imperial purple, surrounded by the symbols of his earthly power, he was transported to the city he had built. The journey took days, a funeral procession of unprecedented magnificence, as the empire he had ruled said farewell to the man who had remade it. In Constantinople, Constantine was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the magnificent structure he had commissioned. His sarcophagus was placed among monuments to the 12 apostles, a positioning that was either profound humility or staggering presumption depending on one's perspective. Constantine, who had never claimed apostolic authority during life, now rested among those who had walked with Christ, suggesting an equality in death that transcended mortal hierarchies. But even before Constantine's funeral rites were complete, the question of succession unleashed violence. Constantine had left the empire to be divided among his three surviving sons. Constantine II would govern Gaul, Britain, and Hispania. Constantius II would rule the east, and Constans would control Italy, Africa, and Illyricum. Additionally, two nephews, Dalmatius and Hannibalianus, were granted territories, creating a complex division that recalled Diocletian's tetrarchy. The army had different ideas. Within months of Constantine's death, soldiers massacred most of the extended imperial family. Constantine's half-brothers and their sons were killed, with only two children, Gallus and Julian, surviving the purge. Whether this massacre was ordered by Constantine's sons, particularly Constantius II, or arose from military initiative, remains debated. But the result was clear. The succession was simplified through blood, leaving only Constantine's direct descendants to rule. The unity Constantine had achieved dissolved rapidly. His sons, who had been trained to rule together, soon turned on each other. Constantine II invaded Italy in 340 to attack his brother Constans and was killed in battle. Constans ruled the West until 350, when he was murdered by a usurper. Only Constantius II survived, eventually reuniting the empire under his sole rule in 353. The dynasty Constantine had hoped to establish proved as fragile as all previous Roman dynasties. Power passed through violence and civil war, the pattern that had plagued the empire for centuries, continuing despite Constantine's efforts to create stable succession. The purple remained what it had always been, a prize seized by the strong, held by the capable, and lost by the weak or unlucky.